Hello, I'm Dr. Odette Suter, and I'm here today to talk to you about feeding for health. When we talk about feeding, it is really important that we just not only feed for surviving so that they have enough food and their bodies can thrive, but we also want to feed them so that they can thrive. That's really the goal of this lecture, is how can you optimize their diet so that they can have a better life, have better functioning bodies, and just be healthier overall. All right, so you can see here on the photos, they're both, these dogs, the dogs and the cat are eating a species appropriate diet. The dog here, her name is Joy. She had some GI problems, and so it was really helpful for her to be able to really chew on a prey for some time rather than just gulping down her food, because she would just throw it back up. So with this, we were imitating, natural feeding habits of dogs, and we were helping her to digest her food better. And the funny thing was too that it was really kind of like in the wild, because there was a raven who would come hopping along, and he thought that, well, he should get a bite of this as well. And so Joy always had to chase him away as soon as he got closer. So it was really imitating nature, and her really protecting her food helped as well with the nervous system to function better, to help her really have the food go down and out the other end, not come back up. And then with cats, obviously they do much better if they eat what they're supposed to be eating, such as rats, mice, squirrels, chipmunks, etc., because that's where they get all of the minerals and vitamins and nutrients that they need in order to thrive. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of change in this world, and just to kind of get started on that, I want to talk to you a little bit about health today, because it's important to know how things are now and how things have changed in order to really understand how we can best help them with nutrition and help them feel better. So today, 1 in 2 Americans suffer from one or more chronic diseases, according to the CDC. And during 2009 to 2010, more than 1/3 of adults, or about 78 million people, were obese, also according to the CDC. Now that's really shocking, isn't it? And you might be wondering why I'm talking about people here, but the thing is, in animals it's just the same. They're not lagging behind with chronic diseases, and there's been a significant increase in that. So for example, if we look at cancer, 45% of dogs older than 10 years of age will die of cancer, and 1 in 4 dogs will develop a tumor during its lifetime. So cancer really accounts for nearly 50% of all disease-related pet deaths each year. That's a huge number. When I went to vet school, there was no talk about this, level of cancer. In fact, I couldn't even remember the lecture that we had on cancer back then, and that was like 30 some years ago. So Banfield, you probably know Banfield. They have practices and clinics everywhere in the country, and they basically pulled all the database, all the numbers that they had, and created a pet health report. And they found that diabetes increased by 32% in dogs and 16% in cats during that time. Dental disease also increased in both animals. Otitis externa, which is basically ear infections, also increased significantly, in particular in cats. Arthritis as well, a significant increase in dogs and even more so in cats. They found others as well, other issues such as kidney failures, allergies, arthritis, obesity, etc. that increase. So you can see there's been a significant increase in chronic diseases just in those 5 years. When they looked at obesity in pets, they found that in the same duration of time, there was an increase of 37%, and in cats 90% increase. So basically double the amount of cats were now obese after these 5 years. That's incredible, isn't it? And it's not that people are all of a sudden feeding their animals a ton more food, which, some may do that, but there's got to be something else that's going on, and that's what we need to figure out. So today, over half of pets are overweight, and the same is true in the horse industry. I don't know the exact numbers, but we do have issues with weight gain in the pet industry, horse industry as well, and all based on metabolic issues. So we need to ask fundamental questions, and the most fundamental question here that every kid asks is why. Why is the sky blue? Why is the wheel turning? God knows what they ask. They always come up with something. And we as adults, we tend to forget to ask why sometimes. And that's the most important question that we need to ask if we have animals that aren't feeling as well as they should, or if we ourselves aren't feeling as well as we should. So let's look at the fundamental diseases a little bit more, questions a little bit more. What is disease? They didn't really talk a whole lot about what disease really is in vet school. They just told us, well, this is cancer, this is allergies, this is arthritis, but they didn't really go into the depth of what is it actually? And why do we get sick? Why do our animals get sick? And how do we go from a healthy state to a diseased state? What has to happen on a molecular level, on a cellular level for this to happen? And then if we figure that out and we are sick and in poor health, how do we get back to health? How do we change the cellular and molecular function so that we can, regain health? So these are really fundamental questions that we ask in every other aspect of life. Let's say your car breaks down, you ask why. You don't just take a piece of duct tape and put it over your check engine light. You ask why is the check engine light is on. You want to find out why, and that's what we need to do in the health care industry as well when we deal with our health and our animals' health. But basically, the good news is that if we apply what we already know, we could end the epidemic of chronic disease in animals and people. That is a strong statement, and it is true. And that's really good because that gives us hope that we're not doomed. There's something that we can do and something that can, that we can do to kind of, come back to health for us, ourselves, and for our animals. So the question is, what is health? So if you look at this balloon right here, it's all nice and shiny and big, and it looks like it's in good health, right? So if we look at this balloon as being one of the cells of the body, it looks like the cell is doing well, right? It's healthy. So what is health? It is basically the cells of the body working optimally and in harmony with each other. Now, what's the opposite? What is disease? Now you can see the cell does not look very healthy anymore, this balloon, right? It's a little shriveled up. Well, disease is basically where the cells are not working optimally and in harmony with each other. So that's very simple, right? There is only one disease. And as you probably figured it out, it's malfunctioning of cells. So there's only one disease. The cells are malfunctioning. And if enough cells are malfunctioning, we start to see symptoms. Now, let's just say that the cells of the pancreas are malfunctioning. We will see problems with diabetes, for example. If we have brain cells that aren't functioning properly, we may see dementia. Or if skin cells aren't functioning properly, we might see some tumor growing on it. So it's all about the cells not functioning properly that are causing disease. And I guess the next question would be, what causes disease? What damages the cells? What gets them to malfunction? And there are basically two causes. And the causes are either a deficiency of nutrients, so if the cells don't get what they need in order to be able to function properly, they can't function properly. And the second one is toxins. So if something interferes with the function of the cells, they again cannot function properly, and toxins are very good about that, at doing that. So I want to talk a little bit about the signs of health, because unfortunately there are a lot of professional health, professionals, veterinarians really, who sometimes ignore these signs of health in favor of doing vaccines or doing things that shouldn't be done at that point because the animal isn't healthy. So you're the advocate of your animal. So I want you to be really aware of what is health. And you can maybe work with me on that, as I go and kind of come up with your own. But basically, bright eyes, appropriate and balanced behavior. So for example, if your animal is always grumpy or anxious or aggressive, etc., it may be a problem, it may be a physical problem that needs to be resolved, okay? Now, for example, in horses, I see that very often. They get anxious and a little bit grumpy at the same time, and often that's related to gut issues. Or if they're lazy, that's what people tell me as well. Well, it's because they just don't want to work. Well, no animal or no person who's healthy is going to be lazy, because if there's enough energy, we want to move and we feel good, and they feel good, they're enthusiastic, they're happy, they're joyful. So basically signs of health would be a happy dog or a happy cat or a happy horse. So healthy skin, normal shedding of coat. Again, more of an example of horses. If they don't shed in the spring, just like every other horse in the barn, if they're slow, that might indicate that there might be a problem with their metabolism. Their thyroid might be a little slow. In dogs, if they have hormonal imbalances, they can just shed a lot of hair, without it growing back. But that's a different issue then. Optimal digestion, sound movement, well-developed muscles, strong tendons and ligaments. You have to question, why is my dog rupturing its cruciate ligaments, for example? They have found that there is some autoimmune component to it that can be a problem with that. Size appropriate weight. An animal should not be overweight if it's getting the appropriate amount of food, because a healthy body will have a healthy metabolism and will keep the weight at a healthy level. And now, what are the signs of disease? Well, just the opposite, obviously, right? Dull eyes, inappropriate, imbalanced behavior, skin issues, slow shedding of coat, excessive coat growth, GI problems, vomiting, abnormal feces, lamenesses, sore and poorly developed muscles, weak tendons and ligaments, obese or underweight. So these are all signs of disease, including also respiratory issues, etc. So anytime there is something not right with your animal and they're showing signs of disease, please be aware that you may not want to vaccinate at that point, because you shouldn't be vaccinating an animal that's unhealthy. So what are the needs of the cell, of a healthy cell? It needs to have the right pH. The pH is basically a measure of the level of acidity in the body. So if the body is too acidic, then the cells cannot function properly. If it's too alkaline, the same will happen. So the pH really has quite a narrow range, especially in the blood. At the tissue level, the range can be a little wider, but still it's good to have it kind of in that range of 7.4. Obviously, the body needs oxygen. We all know that. It needs water, and it needs the nutrients in the correct quantity and quality to build a cell. So looking at a healthy cell versus an unhealthy cell. So in a healthy cell here on the on the left, you can see that the nutrients are absorbed and then the waste is eliminated. Okay? Now on the side of the unhealthy cell, you can see that the absorption might be inhibited or increased, depending, and then we might have some accumulation of waste in here and a limited elimination of that waste, or we can also have a leakage of the cell content, which again is not good because it creates inflammation. So that's basically kind of the simplified version of what is going on with a healthy cell versus an unhealthy cell. When we look at the cells, there's one particular aspect of the cell that's really important, and somebody recently said that the cell membrane is really where the intelligence of the body sits. And there's definitely some truth to it when I think about it, because the cell membrane is a little bit like a switch station. So we have information coming in through the extracellular space, and we have little particles that will attach to, for example, the carbohydrate chains that you can see, this long squiggly thing, and then create a change in that molecule, and then inside the cell there will be a signaling which then creates another kind of chemical reaction. So we have different ways of that communication going on. So we have these little squiggly proteins that go through the cell membrane. We also have integral protein, the big one here in the middle, that is also signaling information to the inside when something attaches to it. And then we also have protein channels all the way to the left where things can go through the channel. But these protein channels, they're very regulated, so it's not like everything can just go through however it wants. Definitely not. There's definitely a regulation. But the cell membrane is basically a double layer of lipids, of fats. And on the outside you have these little bubbles, and they're fat water resistant, so that water cannot go through indiscriminately either. And then on the inside you have a water soluble layer, or actually two, and then again a water insoluble or water resistant layer on the inside of the cell, because again the water supply in and into the cell and out of the cell is very regulated as well, just like any nutrient. So this whole cell membrane is really where things are happening, because the cell membrane determines what goes in and what goes out. And the cell membrane itself is made out of lipids, fats, which is about approximately 30%. It's made out of protein, about 50%, and some carbohydrates. So it does make sense that whatever we put into our animals' bodies will be, translated or transported to the cell membranes to make cell membranes. So it's important that what we feed is appropriate so that these cell membranes can function properly. So for example, all of the dietary fatty acids that we provide are incorporated into these cell membranes. When we talk about fatty acids, omega-3s and omega-6s are pretty well known, right? The omega-3s are the good ones and the omega-6s are the bad ones. But I'd like to clarify that a little bit. The omega-3 fatty acids, they're really good for reduction of inflammation, they help to kill cancer cells, and they improve blood flow overall. Now the omega-6 fatty acids, they also have a very important role. They promote inflammation, and we do need inflammation. The body does need to be able to create inflammation if it needs to heal something, because inflammation is there to help heal the body. Unless it's there chronically, then it will destroy the body. But in general, we do need to be able to, our animals need to be able to mount an inflammatory response if necessary. But normal skin growth, normal growth and normal skin health is also part of what omega-3 fatty acids promote. The thing is that the ratio is important. With a standard American diet, the ratio is somewhere between omega-6, 20 parts omega-6 to 1 part omega-3, and that's the big problem, where there's an imbalance between the two. So the ratio, the correct ratio should be 2 to 4 to 1. Okay, so about 3 to 1. 3 parts omega-6 and 1 part omega-3. Fats are gained from meat, bone marrow, eyes, and brains, and obviously from other, vegetable sources for horses. So for example, if we're looking at fats that are necessary for the small animals, for the carnivores, they do better with fats that come from animals, and the herbivores, they do better with fats that come from plants, which makes sense, right? Because that's what they eat, and so their bodies adapted to utilize these fats better. The ancestral diet for dogs and cats only contains about 6% of fat. It provides fuel, vitamins, and fatty acids. And again, animal sources are better for carnivores, and plant sources better for herbivores. But fats are very delicate. So if you buy omega-3s, some fish oil or hemp oil or flaxseed or etc., you definitely need to refrigerate it. If you buy flaxseed, it's better to grind it up right before you use them, because they spoil very, very quickly. Within a few hours you already have rancid oils if they're pre-ground. So always put them in the refrigerator anyways. But when we talk about fats, we also have polyunsaturated fats, and these polyunsaturated fats are highly inflammatory. And for example, soybean oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, and safflower oil, all of these are highly inflammatory, and we should better stay away from those and not use them. Other fats that are very destructive to the body are hydrogenated fats or trans fats, and they're created through high heat, which we call extruded, and all dry foods, kibbles, are extruded. Some at a lower temperature than that, but there are very few that are baked. But basically what happens through this process, it makes liquid vegetable oils more solid, such as margarine, for example. Now, trans fats obviously are found in all kinds of fried foods, and high heat is really pretty much like frying. So the effect basically on the cells is that all of these trans fats, these hydrogenated fats, they get incorporated into the cell membrane, and the cell membrane fluidity is then reduced, and the cells do not function as well. So it's very important that we really feed these the intelligence of our body, these cell membranes, in the right way, and give them the right nutrients that they need, and not feed them with things that will inhibit their function. So when we look at protein, the body is composed of about 70% protein once the water is removed. So if you remove all the water in the body, whatever is left is 70% of that will be protein. And proteins are basically everywhere. Everything is made out of protein. DNA is protein. Enzymes are protein. Hormones, components of cells, from the cell membrane that I talked to you guys a little bit before, for the immune system, detox, parts are also made out of protein. Proteins also carry substances. They carry hormones. Water homeostasis is also guided by protein. So for example, if there's not enough protein in the cells, then the water will be drawn out of the cell into the area where there's more protein, which then makes them shrivel up. So it's very important that there's enough protein to maintain good water homeostasis. Muscles, bone, tendons, ligaments, and nerves are made of protein as well, etc. So protein are, they're basically needed everywhere. They're essential to all life processes and proper functioning of the body. The Greek already knew that protein were of prime importance. Quantity and quality is very important in protein. So it's not just enough to just eat protein, it has to be the right kind. Because there's protein in everything. There's protein in beans, there's protein in rice, meat, all sorts of plants, etc. But it's important that we have all of the amino acids that make protein. So let me dial back. Amino acids are basically the building blocks that make a protein. So a protein particle is made out of many different amino acids. And the body needs the right amino acids in order to make a particular protein. So if one of the amino acids is not present in sufficient amounts, then that protein cannot be made. Okay? So quality and quantity is very important. And protein is not stored like in the body like fat, and so it must be eaten daily. There are two kinds of proteins again. The vegetable protein, they're lacking sufficient amino acids, so they usually don't have all of the amino acids that the body needs. And that's why, for example, in the Latin American countries, they eat beans and rice. And that's because the beans alone don't have all the amino acids, and the rice itself also doesn't. And by eating, putting them together and eating them in the same meal, they get all the amino acids that they need. But animal protein is usually, superior because it has all of the amino acids included, and it's of good quality. Again, obviously horses will not be eating meats, but for dogs and cats it's very important that they get their animal protein, because that's what they're made to digest, and that's what they utilize much better. In the guaranteed analysis for raw and canned food, we have about 14 to 18%. The percentage is much higher in the dry food, and that's just because there's no water in it. So if you wanted to convert that, you'd have to calculate it out based, with the amount of water in mind. Protein, they can be denatured through heat, meaning that good meat can become really hard to digest, and it may trigger food allergies for animals, so for our carnivores. So it's always better to feed them raw if they can tolerate it. All right, let's move on to the carbohydrates. I don't have a whole lot to say on carbohydrates, but basically sweet potatoes, tapioca, grain, sweet fruit, are basically all loaded with carbohydrates. And the level of carbohydrates is very high in kibble, in dry food. And that's a problem because in nature they only eat about their prey only has about 6% of carbohydrates. And so if we give them a whole lot of carbs, it's just like in humans, they will end up with more inflammation. And because there's more carbohydrates, there's always going to be less fat and less protein, and so they become imbalanced that way. With horses, we also have a lot of carbohydrates in the hay. Some horses are intolerant of eating so much hay, and so by soaking the hay, we can flush out some of the, dissolve some of the carbohydrates out of the hay to make it less rich that way. But basically, carbohydrates are pro-inflammatory, and dogs and cats definitely don't need them for energy. They also don't have the enzymes to digest carbohydrates. Now let's move on to vitamins. Vitamins have very diverse biochemical functions. For example, vitamin D has hormone-like function, whereas vitamin A is a regulator of cell and tissue growth and differentiation. So basically it keeps the cells in check so that they don't become cancerous. Antioxidants such as vitamin E and C are also very important for health. They help with free radical absorption. Precursors for enzyme cofactors are vitamin Bs, for example. They help the enzymes to function better and do their job. So what you need to know about vitamins is that fat-soluble vitamins often are preserved with chemical preservatives, which are not required to be declared on the ingredient list if the preservative was added to the raw material at the factory of origin. Vitamin supplements commonly have plenty of the cheapest to manufacture vitamins and minerals, such as vitamin A and D, and also often very low levels of some of the other more expensive ones, such as vitamin E and phosphorus. Balance is the key. We need a little bit of all of them, or animals need a little bit of all of them in order to be able to function properly. Vitamins, they're split into water-soluble and fat-soluble vitamins, and the water-soluble vitamins are usually just, flushed out right away, so our animals need to have them every day. The water-soluble vitamins are B vitamins and vitamin C. And in our animals, they're manufactured in the healthy GI tract. But if there's some problem with the GI tract or there's a lot of stress which will use up more of the vitamins, then they might be experiencing a deficiency of vitamins that way. Fat-soluble vitamins are vitamin A, D, E, and K, and they're mostly found in food, including vitamin D. Our animals, our furry friends, they do not absorb vitamin D through the skin, or they don't make it in the skin like we do. They have to get it from the food. Vitamin K is also from the diet, and some of the gut bacteria make it as well. Now let's move on to the minerals. Minerals are building blocks. They build bones, they build teeth, etc. And they also regulate bodily processes and activate thousands of enzymes. So for example, zinc is involved in nearly 100 different enzymes, and magnesium in 300 different enzymes. So you can see that if there's a magnesium or zinc deficiency, then the enzymes won't work properly, and all of the biochemical processes will be slowed down, because that's what enzymes do. They speed up biochemical processes to make it easier for those to be able to happen. Minerals have to be present in the good quality and quantity. Their absorption is very complex. Absorption really depends on many different factors such as hormones, other vitamins, the chemical form of the mineral, and also other minerals. The most biologically available form are chelates. Chelating means that the mineral is bound to an amino acid or bound to something. And in this case, when we talk about chelated, oftentimes they say it's amino acid chelated. So it's chelated to an amino acid, which makes it much more easily absorbed. Citrates are somewhat okay, oxides a little bit less, and then sulfates and phosphates, they're even less well absorbed. And sulfates and phosphate are also very acidic, so they're not really the best form. So if your mineral supplements that you're giving your animals have a lot of sulfates and phosphates in them, you know they're not absorbed very well, and they put them in there because they're cheap. So it's not a high quality mineral supplement. For example, magnesium sulfate is Epsom salt. I mean, sure, there's going to be some absorption of the magnesium, but Epsom salt is used for constipation, for example, and it can cause diarrhea that way. Mineral balance is very important because all of the different minerals, they interact with one another. So for example, if we look at mercury, which is the Hg at the right bottom, it will have an interaction with iodine, for example. And if you know all of the different interactions between these minerals, how they support each other's absorption or interfere with one another's absorption, it's really quite interesting how you can work with that, because if you know which mineral counteracts the other, then you can help the balance that way. So for example, with selenium, which is up on the right side, Se, selenium, if you draw a line just across the circle here, you end up with arsenic, As. So for example, if you give the body a little more selenium, it will bump out the arsenic. So there's a lot of good things happening with that. Selenium will also bump out mercury. So for example, if there's mercury or arsenic accumulation in the thyroid gland and you give some selenium, it will bump it out, and then the thyroid gland can work better. So just knowing all of these things can help to create a mineral supplement that can be very helpful to to clean out the body, to help with a little bit of detoxification as well and rebalancing. So deficiency. Why do we have deficiencies? Well, food sources can be deficient because soils are exhausted or present minerals are unavailable to plants. Roundup, which is glyphosate, you've probably all heard of it, has a tendency to bind minerals in the soil. So basically the minerals then become unavailable to the plant because they're bound so that the plant cannot take them up. Obviously we can end up with a deficiency due to inappropriate food. So if we don't feed our animals all the nutrients that it needs, then it will become deficient. Digestive malfunction plays a big role in that as well, because if it's not digested and absorbed, well, it doesn't get into the body, right? And then basically also the inability to use the absorbed nutrients. So that would be more of an issue on the cellular level then. Unfortunately, with all the deficiency that's going on, due to these factors here, oftentimes our animals end up overfed but undernourished. Okay, so they're constantly hungry. They always want more food because they're missing something. Their body is telling them, I need more of something. And so they're just trying to fill that hole. And that's why, so many animals become overweight, because there's something missing. But even though they look like they're getting too much, they're undernourished because they don't get the nutrients that they need. And I call that starvation. Now in humans, there's a very good example for that. For example, if there's not enough magnesium in the body at present, there's a craving for chocolate that can emerge. Or for example, if a person doesn't eat enough fats and protein, then they may have more of a craving for carbohydrates. So it's very important that we make sure that the animals get all the nutrients they need so that they don't end up starving. Another big problem that we need to look at, when we talk about nutrition and talk about food, is that we have a lot more toxicity going on than in the past. Since World War II, there have been about 1.5 million new chemicals put on the market. Most of them are carcinogenic, and hardly any of those have been tested for safety. So we and our animals were basically bombarded with chemicals every day. And 80,000 of these chemicals, they interfere with hormones. They're xenoestrogens. Basically, they mimic estrogens. And that's why amphibian males are turning into females. They're developing female organs. Or little girls at 5 years of age are starting to have their period. So that's really what's going on. It's because of these xenoestrogens. And these xenoestrogens are very inflammatory, which is obviously not very good for the body. And when you look at these toxins, you can see that the change that's happened since the 1940s to now. In the 1940s, there was about 1 million pounds of chemicals produced, or kilograms, I should say, produced, whereas in 2010, we were at 200 plus billion kilograms of chemicals, synthetic chemicals. Now, that's a huge change, and the body needs some help to deal with that because the liver wasn't made to process that much chemical onslaught. So there's different ways of helping the body with that, and one of them is nutrition, by just feeding them a good nutrition so that all of the cells get the nutrients that they need so that they can get rid of that waste more easily. So what are sources of toxins? We have external toxins such as air, coming from the air. It's in the water, food, drugs, in the environment, bedding in the barns, carpets, molds, etc. And then body products, shampoos, fly sprays, creams, and whatever we put on our bodies. And although this picture with that horse in the bathtub there with all that pink stuff being coming onto his back, that may look like fun, but that's really how all of these chemicals get into our bodies. And obviously whatever we're using as cleaning products, all of those obviously have a huge impact on us as well. But we also have internal sources of toxins. Remember, the cells, they produce waste as well that needs to be eliminated just in the process of all of these biochemical reactions that are occurring in there. So normal metabolism will create toxins and waste, basically. The digestive system produces toxins and waste, and that's why we go, we and our animals go to the bathroom every day, hopefully. Allergic reactions themselves, they keep promoting a chemical production of chemicals that create more inflammation. And then stress, etc. So we definitely have internal and external sources of chemical production, and we need to make sure that we can limit this as much as possible. But basically, the saying is, you are what you eat, right? And Raymond Francis said, what you eat today will affect or damage your health tomorrow. And that goes for our animals as well. So whatever we put into our bodies and into their bodies will affect our health. Maybe not right away, but it will. And foods either heal or harm. Now this, for example, is a good diet, a good food for an animal, for a carnivore, for a dog, right? There's raw meat, there's organ meat, and there are vegetables and fruits that are ground down so that it can, the nutrients can be absorbed. Now this is more of a harmful food because it's dead and it's dry and it's loaded with carbohydrates, so not something recommended for an animal, if for a dog or cat, if you want to keep them healthy for a long time. For horses, we would be focusing on a food that's more based on seeds, for example, because seeds are higher in fats and protein and lower in carbohydrates. Whereas if we feed them corn or oats or other kinds of grains, they tend to have too much carbohydrates, which can cause them, to have more metabolic issues. So again, very important to not buy, processed food and feeding them processed food like that, because it's dead. There's nothing left in it. I like Hippocrates. He was amazing. He lived in 400 BC, which is, thousands of years ago, and he just already knew that food can be our medicine. So let food be thy medicine, and medicine shall be thy food. And it's true, what we feed our animals is important. We need to pay attention to what, we put into our bodies from, the first day of their lives, basically, and not just start switching to something better once the problems arise. So important is to just really work on prevention and be proactive. Here we go. Pottinger cats. That's one of my favorite studies, and I think it's one of the best studies that was ever done. Pottinger was an MD. He lived in the 1940s, and he began a study with 900 cats, a 10-year study. And how that happened, it's a funny story. He was working in a clinic where they worked with people with, tried to heal people with tuberculosis. And in order to do so, they were using adrenal extract from cats. And once people started to hear about that, they started to dump cats at his doorstep. So he ended up with 900 cats. And because he had to feed them all, and he didn't have enough raw food, coming from one place, he had to feed them a different diet. And he started to notice some differences. And so he decided to do this study. So the study was basically aimed at determining the effects of processed food on the body. And he also wanted to examine the genetic propensity of passing degenerative disease traits from generation to generation. So he wanted to find out how food was affecting the coming generations. And so he split his cats into two groups. Group A was receiving a raw diet, and Group B was receiving a cooked food diet, which was basically 2/3 cooked meat and 1/3 raw milk. The first generation, second, third, and fourth generation in the raw-fed group, they all remained healthy. In Group B, they started to develop degenerative diseases and became lazy towards the end of life in the first generation. In the second generation, they developed degenerative diseases and illness in the middle of life, and they also were starting to lose coordination. In the third generation, they developed diseases and illnesses in the beginning of life, and many of them actually died before 6 months of age. Some were born blind, weak. They had reproductive issues, parasites, skin diseases, allergies, increasing from 5% to over 90% of the animals being plagued by skin diseases and allergies. Their bones became soft and pliable, and they also showed adverse personality changes. So when he says that, saw that the bones were changing, basically some of the bones in these cats started to disappear. So the zygomatic bone here, the cheekbone, started to disappear and become smaller and smaller until it was not present in some of the cats anymore. And so when you see a cat that has a really narrow face, it's very possible that they don't even have that bone, or it's very, very small. They also started to have issues with dental malalignment, etc. The fourth generation wasn't even produced. Either the third generation parents were sterile, or the fourth generation cats were aborted before birth. So you can see that on the raw diet, they remained healthy through 4 generations. On a processed diet, and believe me, that kind of processed diet was probably a whole lot better than what we can get these days, because in the 1940s we didn't have that sort of processing happening, plus we also had a lot less toxicity going on. So you can see that, there was definitely a big change and getting worse from one generation to another. And it makes sense because when I look at my lineage, my great-grandparents, they lived up into their, late 90s. My grandparents also into their 90s. But my mom died at 48. I started to get sick around 20, and my niece already has issues, had issues ever since she was born, of constantly being sick. And it's not that we ate bad food. In the contrary, we're working really hard at it. But you can see that because of all the toxicity and all, that huge increase of toxicity, it's so much harder to stay healthy. And that's again why I encourage you to be proactive with your animals and work on feeding them healthy food and doing everything that you can in order to keep them healthy so that they don't have that decline happening. So back to the Pottinger cats, they showed respiratory, gastrointestinal, constitutional issues, skin disorders, allergies, hypothyroidism, osseous malformations, as I mentioned, dental malocclusion, and reproductive disturbances. Just a little more on the dental malocclusions. There was a dentist by the name of Dr. Price. He traveled around to different Aboriginal groups to see what they were eating, and he noticed that all of them had a perfect dental alignment. They had wide jaws and all of their teeth had plenty of space. Now when we look at our civilization, where there's a lot of processed food going on and being consumed, most of the kids nowadays, they end up with braces because they have such misalignment of the teeth and not enough space in the in the jaw for them to grow in good alignment. So it's very close. It's very similar to what's going on with the cats and what Pottinger noticed with the cats. Pottinger also tested the value of cat excreta as fertilizer, and he found that plants would not grow in the presence of waste from cooked food cats and cooked milk cats. So basically, after they finished the study, they just checked the different pens to see how quickly things were growing in them, because the cats were living outdoors and in these pens, and they had, I'm sure they had shelter, I can't remember now. But in any case, obviously it was exposed to the environment, and so plants could grow in there, but they didn't grow all that well in the processed food fed cats. Then he didn't stop at that. Even before he ended the experiments, obviously, he wanted to find out how long it would take to regenerate the cats to good health. So he took the cats from the first and second generation of cooked meat, from the cooked meat group, and returned them to a raw diet, and their offspring was then maintained on an optimum diet. And the results were as follows. They required about 4 generations to regenerate to normal health. Wow. The second generation had some improvement in resistance to disease. The third generation, they still had allergies and skeletal and soft tissue changes, but to a lesser degree. In the fourth generation, most of the severe signs of deficiency and the symptoms disappeared, but seldom completely. So even after fourth generation, there were still some issues. And he also found that, for example, a cat that was subjected to a deficient diet for 12 to 18 months had issues with reproductive efficiency, and it was so reduced that she was never able to give birth to normal kittens again. Even after 3 to 4 years of eating an optimum diet, her kittens still showed signs of deficiency in skeletal and dental development. And when her kittens were maintained on an optimum diet, a gradual reversal and regeneration was taking place. So it doesn't take that long of a deficiency to create major issues. And if we look at how many women have reproductive issues these days, we can certainly see a correlation here. Genetics. That's a loaded word. We tend to blame everything on genetics. Now, in dogs, cats, and horses, I'm not sure how much genetics really play a role, but in humans, they found that only 5% of all diseases are really have a genetic origin, which is good, because it means that if it's not genetic, we can change it, right? So genetics basically load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger, meaning that if you have a gun, you don't touch it, nothing happens, right? If the genes are left alone to do what they're supposed to do and not influenced negatively by the environment, they will do what they're supposed to do. The environment we create for our cells controls the expression of our genes. So that's just saying it in different words. So what do we feed? Now you go into a pet store and there's all that food in there, and what do they need? What's the best food for your animals? Now for dogs and cats, here comes my ranking, and it's not just mine actually. Many veterinarians are saying the same thing. But basically, the least favorite, I think the one that's worst for health, is dry kibble. Canned food is a little bit better, because at least it may not contain as much carbohydrates, but still it's cooked food. And then number one, is raw. Okay, we're again back to the same picture that I showed you earlier with the ground up raw meat with ground up bone in it, and then some organ meat and some vegetables and fruit. So this is really the best food, and if you look back at the Pottinger cat study, you can now see how important that is. So number one, raw food. Now for horses, there's definitely also a ranking. The more carbohydrates a horse feed has, the worse it is. And unfortunately, most of the horse feeds that I see out there are loaded with garbage, basically. Just whatever is not being used in the human industry is put into horse food. So focus on one that's clean, doesn't have a whole lot of wheat middlings and soy and things that interfere with the body. And focus more on something that has seeds in it and is cleaner and more simple. The price we pay. So if we don't feed good food, if we feed cheap food, which a lot of people tell me, well, it's so expensive to feed raw, or this bag of horse food is so expensive, I can't afford it. Well, let's just see what happens when we feed cheap food. We end up with cheap ingredients that are harmful for the body and create poor digestion. They can cause toxicity and deficiency, which we know now that creates malfunctioning cells. And what happens if we have malfunctioning cells? We have disease. And what happens when we have disease? We have vet bills, layups, emotional distress, etc. So feeding cheap food really is very, very costly, and I don't recommend it at all. So do invest into good nutrition for your animals, because that is crucial, because nutrition is life. So can you afford to feed your animals poor quality food? No. This cat is saying no. And what is the salvation or the inconvenient truth? Health is a matter of choice, and we are responsible for it. We don't get sick, we make ourselves sick by making bad choices. Of course, it's not quite this simple nowadays because of the high level of toxicity that we are exposed to and that we can't get around to, get away from. But nevertheless, if we choose a junk food diet for our animals that is highly processed and pretty dead, that's what we'll get. So we heal and stay healthy by making good choices for our animals. We can do it. So if you have any questions, you want more information, or you want to learn more about diet and what to give to your pet, stay tuned for the next episode. Nutrition application. We will be talking about reading labels, what is put into pet foods, and how you can make your own.